In terms of the opportunity, I've been in Asia now for 12 years, had a career of over 30 years. And I can say from my standpoint is I've never seen in my career such a boom in terms of the number of projects being talked about, the number of projects being in construction and opening in the themed entertainment industry.
China right now is changing. The middle class is representing over 50% of the population is the middle class. And I think that they're getting more involved with mobile phone app, online buying, sports and entertainment, and all these areas is a huge market for United States to get into China, besides the manufacturing, besides the technology, and all of that. China is right now have built so many theme parks, and I was told that there were 60 theme parks that's on the way in China that need to be built all over China. And they need help. They need help from themes, to design, to engineering, to the business of how to get fans.
The market is exploding right now. I have many developers coming to me saying, I need good qualified design companies and turnkey solution companies. They really like the idea of hiring Western companies who have some kind of a presence in China. And so there are numerous projects, probably almost 100 or more, different themed environment projects that are happening all over China right now. And like I say, the developers are looking for good people. So if you're anxious to come, if you want to get involved, the possibilities are definitely here.
Good evening. So as you can see from these videos, China is a market on the move. With hundreds of projects in development, there's never been a better time to get a piece of the pie. But how do you know if working in China is right for you? If you decide yes, how do you get a job there? And then if you get the contract, how do you make sure that the project is going to be successful? We're going to discuss these topics and more in our kickoff of TEA Talks Live, a series that looks to pair entertainment professionals with topical issues in themed entertainment. My name is Clara Rice, and I'm Director of Communications at JRA, and I'm honored to welcome you tonight and to welcome this distinguished panel of speakers who have decades of combined experience working in China. They are Louis Allen, VP of Creative at Adirondack Studios, Glenn Birket, owner and founder of Birket Engineering, Ryan Miziker, Creative Director of Miziker Entertainment and a TEA International Board member, Paul Osterhout, Vice President and Executive Producer of Universal Creative and also a TEA International Board member, and Craig Russell, Project Imagination Executive with Walt Disney Imagineering. Not with us tonight, unfortunately, is Ashley Rose of Science North. In typical Canadian fashion, she got snowed in. But she is with us in spirit. You may have noticed some other special guests that are not with us tonight because they are, in fact, doing business in China right now. They are Thomas Megna, CEO of Megna Entertainment Group, Margaret Wong, President of California Center, and Chris Yoshii, Vice President and Asia Pacific Lead at AECOM. We appreciate the time that they've taken to put these videos together and think they will add another layer to the program, so thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't thank some of the other key players in putting this event together. This event was conceived by Lauren Barrows with Alcorn, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight because she's at a conference in Amsterdam, but again, with us in spirit. Scott Gill, President of ThemeWorks and the Eastern Division Board, has been a great supporter of this event from the very beginning. We'd like to thank the Garden Theater, Brian Fallon and his team for being such gracious hosts. We'd also like to thank Justin Ruka of Alcorn for being our stage manager this evening, and to Melissa Rumino of the Nassau Company for wrangling our volunteers. Ian McDaniel from Good Theory Studios will be recording tonight's event so that people from all over the world can benefit from what we're learning tonight. So thank you, Ian. It is very rare to have an event that doesn't have, a TEA event that doesn't have Joe Fox's name attached to it somehow. And tonight is no exception. All the videos you see tonight were stitched together by him. And he has been the fabulous technical guru that he always is. So, good friend, thank you very much. With all that said, let's jump into our first segment. Should I do business in China?
And doing business in China is not as simple as you think. You know, a lot of people say why you could be able to last that long and what you've been doing. And I would say that number one, you have to have a lot of patience. You know, China is different than United States, you know, from all the way from decision making, the distribution system, and all the corporation setup is very different. So number one, you have to have a lot of patience. And secondly, you have to do a lot of due diligence, meaning that, you know, a lot of the US company will be able to sell what they think it's going to be working in the United States. You have to do your due diligence, meaning that you have to understand, you know, how China behave and how the decision making is being made and how the organizational structure is going to be. So, you know, I think that, you know, we need to be able to sell what Chinese want and what the market needed and how they make the decision. So doing the due diligence is something that I highly recommend it. It's not as much a translation, it's more about what they're looking for and how the corporation, how the companies works that way.
Chinese companies, when they go out to look at foreign consultants, they want a consultant or a consultant or supplier or vendor that's going to be, you know, more creative. It's going to have a higher quality. It's going to have more experience with doing this before. You know, have you done this many times before? Have you learned those lessons? So they want experience, they want quality, and they want creativity. And so if you have those characteristics, then you have something you can offer them. How do you land business in China, or how do you do business in China? China is a, there's a lot more emphasis on the relationships in China. So who do you know, how do you get along? Do you have a common understanding of the goals? Are you providing, you know, an added value to the project and services? So they really want to know, there's a lot more about the personal connections with the business. Contracts are still important. They still are enforced in China, but they're kind of less important than personal contacts. People still are much more face-to-face, eye to eye. They want to see you, they want to talk to you, they want to shake hands, they want to have meals with you, they want to get to know you, and they want to know that you are personally going to be dedicated to make sure your product or your service happens and it's successful.
So Ryan, we're going to kick things off with you. How do you determine whether there is a demand for your services in China and whether you can compete with the local resources that provide the same services? What is Musiker Entertainment Group's thought process been?
Well, I'd say, first of all, if the audience for that question is the Themed Entertainment Association, then absolutely there is a demand for our services. What we bring to the table is something unique, and we have a special kind of magic that we provide. The first time I worked in China was in 2005, and things were very different then. There was much more of a demand for creative storytelling. This was a live show project, and it was all kind of new, not just for me, but I think for audiences in general. And in the 12 years that I've been working in China, now 12 years later, audiences are very sophisticated, and they demand original, creative, innovative entertainment. And that's what we provide, and I think that's really what everyone here at the TEA is really striving for. So So to us, there was no question of whether China was, whether doing business was right for us. It was an automatic yes. The question became, how do we do that? And I think that's what Chris was getting at in his video, and something I think we'll explore a little bit further.
Glenn, we talked in some previous correspondence about the 3 levels of going to China. What are they, and how do you decide what going into China means?
I think that starting out, you can work from a distance from a U.S. office. You can take business trips to China to go court the work and then execute in the U.S., take more business trips to implement the work and follow up. But that's limiting. So the next level you might go to is to have a representative in China, someone that you hire there, but without establishing a payroll there. You make the payment from outside of China, so you're keeping a minimal footprint in China. You might go to the next level, which might be to have a Chinese partner. Pros and cons there. It can be a difficult relationship. We did that originally. It was a very good thing in some ways, but eventually we decided we needed to get beyond that. It certainly does move you forward, though. You could establish an entity, a contracting entity there, a corporation in China. You hear people talk about a WFOE, wholly foreign-owned enterprise. That's one of the constructions in China for a corporation. That will allow you to do business. You don't have to have employees there, but you can. At least you can navigate the tax, the difficulties with taxes better if you have a local corporation, but you could keep that at a minimum. Then you could go all in and actually start a true company where you have all the staff necessary to do the design, production, installation, commissioning with all Chinese local staff, and develop an ongoing entity that can sustain itself in China. And how you know, I think you need to take one step at a time, because I don't think you want to, it's an education process. You need to move slowly. So I would say take it easy at first and move up when you know you're ready.
Well, Louis Adirondack actually has an entity over there. How did that come to be? And what was that process?
Well, I endorse what Glenn said, and what the film said. You have to be patient in China. As a company, we started with an opportunity, recognized an opportunity in China, started sending people over short-term trips, negotiated a deal, received the work. Almost all of the preliminary work, the design work, was done in our studios in New York. When the project went on to the design build phase, where basically we're taking normally the client will provide the intent of the design, then we'll work with the client to do the schematic phase of the design within a budget for a specific attraction or attractions. And then it goes into design development, which really has to integrate itself with local code and fabrication, which, quite honestly, for an American company to import product to China is not a good idea. There's a lot of talent in China. So we took the path, we decided, okay, we started with the first project, then we established an administrative director in China, Chinese national, who helped us with business and just a super talented person, both creatively and administratively, helped introduce us, helped soften it. We set up an office in Shanghai, which was and established a wholly owned foreign entity. That entity was and is pretty much our administrative headquarters, but our real work and our office work happens with our partner companies, because we do partner a lot with companies. And we rather than a formal partnership, we create consortium agreements where the groups collaborate, can be co-signers on a contract, with very clear delineation of who's responsible for what task within the project and shares a joint liability for their individual tasks. That process to get us from first going into China to actually creating the wholly owned foreign entity and finding the right accountant, the right legal help, because there are fees everywhere in China, and the Chinese big business structure is not the same as, it's not as linear as the structure we're used to. So a lot of times you think you're talking with the entity you want to speak with, but what you realize is you're really talking to a representative of the entity you're speaking with, who actually doesn't really do the work but has an entity that reports to him. So you learn to navigate it, you be patient. The idea with an office in China, our next step will be to establish a business development office in Asia, or in Beijing, which will expand our experience there, and we'll start staffing. We'll put some core members of our New York group in China full-time and start working then in developing a larger labor base using Chinese talent to expand our operations there. So we have an office there. It's a slow process. Be patient and take it step by step would be my advice.
Craig, you're in a little bit different position because they had to make the choice of whether to go to China. Disney made that for you. So what has been the process? How did Shanghai Disneyland come to be? And how did you balance the cultural considerations of China with maintaining the integrity of the Disney brand?
So, as you say, Disney was in a rather different position. We decided in the late 90s that China was a place that we had to be. We wanted desperately to be. And, for us, from the beginning, it was less about building a park and a resort, and it was much more about the opportunity to define Disney as a brand to 1.4 billion people who had yet to really have it defined fully for them. And so there was no real question about going there. The tricky part and the sort of non-trivial part was really establishing the priorities of what it meant to be there, because the only logical way to do a project the scale of what we were able to achieve is to partner with the government and government wholly owned, government entities. And we knew that would involve a tremendous amount of patience. It took us about 10 years overall to negotiate a deal. And then from then, quite a number of years to develop the project. We knew that it would require a tremendous amount of relationship building, which it did. One of the reasons it took so long is that on our government partner side, those partners kept on moving. The Shanghai local government changed twice while we were negotiating. And so we sort of lost those relationships to some degree and had to backtrack from that. So we knew that, but I think maybe most fundamentally, we knew that we would be negotiating to some degree every day of the project, and we would be compromising to some degree every day of what throughout the project, and we knew that we had to be just absolutely crystal clear about our priorities. So we set very simple, very straightforward priorities: the safety first, quality second, and then those had to live above schedule and budget, which is a tough thing to do. But in that marketplace, we found we would just keep on coming back to that. Not because you can't get a safe job and a high quality project there, but because there were things about certainly our partners' expectations and ours that were just often misaligned. And so we just had to have tremendous patience, tremendous will, and be clear with them where we would compromise, where we could not compromise, because our brand was at stake, and the brand was really what we were trying to define in the first place. And over time, it took a lot of time. I think over time we were successful, but certainly the time it took us would tell you how difficult it was often at times. Relative to, to speak a little bit to the audience, and we can probably get into this a little more in detail, if anybody would like. We went in, I'd like to think that we went into this project once we'd negotiated a deal with with a pretty strong resolve that this is an audience, the sophistication of this audience could not be taken for granted. And that although it's not a very sophisticated audience in a data point a decade ago, it's an audience that's changing at the speed of light. And so we decided very early on that we would leave nothing to chance and we would not aim low. We talked a lot about sort of historically how we had succeeded or less than succeeded in different places in the world. And we decided with Bob Iger's leadership very much just from the onset to aim very high and to aim at this audience as if it were at or above the levels of the audiences here. And I think it has ended up being a good move. Tough to do, tough to pull off, but I think wise in the end.
Paul, when you're looking at people American companies in particular, to work with you in Beijing, is there something above and beyond what you would normally look for in a supplier when you're talking about China?
No, because I think our audience or our customers in Beijing are expecting a world-class experience. And so to deliver on those expectations, we need to use suppliers that we are comfortable with. There are so many companies that can deliver projection systems or fire systems or animation that we are comfortable with, that we know we can deliver. Now, obviously, being in China, we're going to want to find localized companies that can deliver on other systems. It just makes business sense to find those other companies. But for our park in Beijing, we're going to use the same world-class ride vendors that we would use in Orlando or Hollywood or Osaka. They're just that step ahead. Now, I think as we continue this journey to deliver the Beijing project, we're going to find those Chinese vendors that are going to be step up. I mean, Disney found a lot of them. We're going to kind of build on who they found, and we're going to exercise them, and they're going to become our suppliers. But for the most part, the high-tech stuff, the real pushing the envelope stuff, we're going to use the same suppliers we've always used. That doesn't mean we're not going to keep looking for more localized people. It's just going to be a process. And I think the key here is patience, and you're going to hear it a lot of times from pretty much everybody. I can't stress enough how relationships in China are so important. They've got to trust us, we've got to trust them, and so that is a process, and it's certainly well underway for what we're doing in Beijing. To find those people that can do what we ask them to do is going to be a process.
On the flip side of that, for the vendors on stage, what are some special considerations? How is bidding on a project in China different from bidding on a project anywhere else? Whether it's the way you look at staffing, whether it's the way you look at price, whether it's the way just how you approach the bid philosophically. Is there a difference between how you bid on a project in China versus anywhere else?
When we look at projects, at least in the initial phase of the project, we'll do rough order of magnitudes. We'll take a look at the scope of work. We'll look at the relative values of what we're building. We will pretty much estimate them as if we were doing them in the United States. And we normally start off that rough order of magnitude. Then we may go to China, and we may discover there are vendors who can perform that work for a better price. There's a myth that things cost less in China. I don't think you guys have discovered that at Disney, or Universal, or any of the other groups. So you come up with, you're right, it's a pretty good number. If you buy Echo shoes in Shanghai or Echo shoes in Orlando, they cost the same. They're not cheaper in China, wherever they're built. That's just an example. I was shopping for Echo shoes recently. But and I actually was in Hong Kong, and I thought I'd get a deal, but I didn't. So I think you pretty much bid it with your expertise. The other thing is, if you do choose and you purchase and you find the proper vendor overseas, and they have the skill set and the tooling and everything they need to do the project, you still find, or we find that we do embed artisans or artists from our company or specialists from our company during the production period to make sure that it's meeting the quality standards that are imposed on us by our clients. The Universal and Disney general performance specifications are pretty rigid. So unless you pay a lot of attention, when you sign on the line, you agree to meet those specifications. So any cost savings that we do make, you're buying the product, but we're putting the value into the product by having the supervision. So the quick answer is no. When we bid it as if we're doing it in America. And we find that it's pretty close to what it will cost us to do in China.
I'd say there is a point if you're doing a bid for what you really try hard to protect, is your absolute lowest number. Say there is a point at which you need to stick to that, and it's in the best interest of your client to hold that line, because that's the best chance for success for everyone. And I think maybe not unlike anywhere, CEOs in China often don't get good information from their subordinates. And as Americans, we're sort of known for being direct, and I think it's a good thing. We're pretty honest with how we approach things, and they actually need that honesty from us for their own success. For whether it's how much something's going to cost or how long it's going to take, and it's hard sometimes to fight that battle. But it's really in our client's best interest if we're doing it the right way to achieve the kind of results that they're looking to us to deliver.
Glenn, any?
The answer to the question is different for me if the client is Disney or Universal, who are building in China, because Disney and Universal do a great job of specifying what they would like us to build. They understand what it takes to build these attractions. They articulate it very clearly. Our marching orders are laid out for us. That's great. If your client is a Chinese client, the specification may be they name the Disney or Universal attraction they want you to build without calling it that, and say, how much will that cost? It's a totally different experience, and so your approach to bidding is much, much more cautious. They can't imagine how much that costs and don't want to pay it, so there's an education process there. It's difficult. The other thought that comes to mind with what you ask is the tax implications of doing business in China. The pitfalls are so large that what you might imagine as the money that you might make on a project can be completely consumed and erased by the taxes that you didn't know you were going to have to pay. So there's an educational process there that you have to go through.
Any other thoughts before we move on to the next section?
I'd add briefly to very much reflect what these guys are saying from an owner's perspective. It's easy to buy from people who know what you basically are buying as it pertains to two things that I think are important about China. One is simply quality. The other is integration. The work that we do is certainly of high quality, but it's fair to say it's tricky. I found more people in that marketplace than not were overwhelmed and surprised by the level of integration of our work. And so if you're buying it from somebody you trust to understand that's one thing. If you don't, you need, and to some degree this is tough to completely specify. So when we found ourselves dealing with new folks, we did our best to make sure we were buying that integration, and then, of course, because the contract is only so meaningful, and then just on top of that, teach the heck out of it, and be patient and really invest in teaching to make sure those folks understood what we meant, because it's not necessarily intuitive.
Just to add to what Craig was saying, it's easy to find a robotics manufacturer in China, but find somebody that does animation for a theme park. We are such a specialized industry. You know, you could find somebody that builds boilers in China, but to find somebody that does flame effects inside a building is completely different, completely different. It's the same, but it's not. And so the education process about how specialized what we all do is a big challenge. It's not the same. And you get some government official who wants to look at all your bidding processes and they go like, well, we can give you 20 companies that do that same thing. No, not really. You can't.
Okay, so part one, you've decided, yes, I should do business in China. Well, how do you get the job? That's our next segment.
In U.S. market, they're very very well structured. So you have designing firm, you have equipment firm, you have construction, and you have all of that very well defined. But in China, it's not. So you almost have to give them a one-stop job solution that will be able to help them to kind of navigate all of the details. And thirdly, I would recommend that you will have to be able to get some type of good partners in China. Penetrating the China market with the government structure and also with the tax and all these, currency and all of that, is better off that you would be able to find some type of a local partner that you could trust and you could be able to work with. And that's what I would highly recommend.
And absolutely, you need a translator. The executives that you'll be meeting for developers, the highest level don't speak much English. The lower level people do, which is great and sometimes an asset, but don't expect that you will go into a meeting and always have someone from the client's side speaking for you. So it's always best to have a good translator. Another thing that I learned as far as getting the deal done is having someone on the inside is really important. So teaming up with a local company who has a connection with a developer is really a great thing. It helps make things move smoothly and also helps with getting paid too.
Do you need a local partner or a local office? It is definitely obviously preferred because again the personal connectivity to have with customers in China. Having a local partner, I think you need to be obviously careful that partner has your best interest in mind as well as their own, so that it's a win-win situation. Certainly a lot of cases where the local partners have just gone off and done things without the foreign partners knowing what's going on. So I think it is it's helpful to have an office or a local partner. And again, I think if you're progressing in your business from one level to the next, it's important.
Paul, we're going to start with you this round. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of translators and partnerships, I want to talk a little bit about more of the cultural aspects of setting up shop in China. You had talked a few weeks ago about how you and the late Catherine Griffiths did extensive customer research over bottles of wine and, to make sure that Universal Beijing was telling the right story. Can you talk about that? Do they really not like roller coasters?
No, they love roller coasters, actually. You have to remember that it's been 38 years since they've come out of the Cultural Revolution. I mean, 38 years ago, they were cut off from the world, essentially. So you have couple of generations of new people. Also, about the same time, they implemented the one-child policy. So when you think about the dynamic of a family that could potentially visit a theme park or a cultural center or a museum, it's an inverted pyramid. You've got 4 grandparents, you've got 2 parents, you've got a child. It's reverse of what we are kind of used to. And so you have to think about that dynamic, that the child really is the decision maker in that dynamic. And they typically travel in groups. So if you have a theme park, you have to now imagine this group is going to visit the theme park at the same time, this pod of 6 people. And so you have to think about that. And then culturally, they are a very proud people. It manifested itself in the 2008 Olympics. That was like the high point of their showing off to the world. And they love to show off, they love to, when Westerners come to China, they love to show off their culture. They're very proud of who they are as people. With that said, they're very driven. They're a very driven culture. They don't think about rewards as, I want to have this car or I want to have this house. They think about, I have to work harder to get where I want to be. So children, up until high school, they focus on their exams for university. It's all about that exam to get into the best school. So when you think about how they relax, how they deal with the stresses in their life, and that's kind of what we're trying to help, what we're trying to do. The 2 things that always come up when we talk about consumers in China are what they're looking for: escapism from reality, which is not different than a Western audience. It's just more intense, much more intense. But they want the same things. And they so much want a Western experience. If we were going to build a park and we had all this Chinese cultural stuff in it, that's not their escapism. They have the Chinese culture. They want escape. They want to get away from that. With that said, they want to have these touchstones back to who they are. So you might design a theme park or a museum experience that's Western or exotic, but the food might be Chinese. Again, just this touch back to who they are, because they don't want to lose that. They want this level of comfort, but they want to get out there and experience something different. So I've been going to China now for 4 years or so. Every year I go, the change to more Western culture is so apparent. Every year it's dramatic. It's dramatic how they're emerging to be a Western kind of, and I'm not saying they're a Western civilization, but they're embracing Western values more and more every time I go back. And I don't know if you saw the same thing.
I think I've seen the same thing. I've been going there for the better part of 20 years. I see the same thing. However, I think one of the things that we tried to do very hard is, I mean, there's some things that, to your point, this audience loves just like any audience loves. And then there's an aspect of this where you're playing to urbanites, and so they're, so predominantly urban audiences both of us are playing to. So there are things that they're going to love that are just unique to what their experience is because they live in a gigantic city. So the escapism that's afforded them, just like Tokyo, et cetera, is fantastic. But one of the things that we ended up doing that I think has served the park pretty well is to take quite a number of Disney stories. I mean, Bob Iger and Bob Weiss sort of coined this notional phrase of authentically Disney, distinctly Chinese, which really means take Disney stories and try to tell them with a Chinese sensibility. So what we ended up doing from the Olympics, through predominantly the Olympics and the expo in Shanghai, there was an amazing amount of creative talent that became very evident. And we ended up hiring, especially with the live entertainment, producers, directors, writers, choreographers, stunt trainers and coordinators who really crafted much of the way we told some of the stories. There's some classic stories told in a classically Disney way, but there were also, I think, one of the nice blends of this particular park is those stories that are told in a very with a Chinese sensibility that seem to, they don't make sense to us as we listen to them, but they seem to not only be translated but land well with the audience. So it's a blend.
If I may, you talk about this, and I heard it on Thomas Megna, you know, and I've heard the word a lot. We talk about translators. You need a good translator. Chinese, the little bit that I know about it, and I'm quite ignorant about it, and going there, I started to realize how ignorant I was about it. I mean, you know, in 1987 or 85, I painted Nixon in China, big opera, right? That was a big deal, Nixon in China, you know? That wasn't that long ago. And you know, we painted giant portrait of Chairman Mao, and, you know, it was I think it was Robert Wilson, a very avant-garde opera. I think it's come back. I forget who did it. But you know, we're really ignorant about that country. You know, we go over there. I remember Andy Warhol's interview where he said, "Oh, I love China. It's all little people in blue suits and hats, and oh, it's so wonderful." We have our Western perception of a culture that's our culture is 200 years old, their culture is 3,000, 4,000 years old. We try to visualize that culture through 200-year-old eyes when they're living it for thousands of years. And then we talk about translation, which, I'm sorry, I got off on a buzz there. But when you, what's so critical, it isn't the translation, and you hit it. You have people who are interpreting it. And those voices, and Thomas said, make sure you have your own translator. He meant interpreter. Make sure you don't want to rely on the clients. You want your own person, and those people are so valuable, and they're so precious. And the best ones aren't translating; they're interpreting, and they're making that cultural bridge from east to west, because the translation won't do that. Interpretation does that. So I applaud those. If there's any interpreters out there, keep at it. We need you desperately.
If I could just answer the second part of your question about what we think, what they want, or what they don't want. Do they like roller coasters? I hear that question a lot. I also hear, do they like getting water on them splashed? Do they volunteer to get up on stage and be part of the experience? We have this notion that they don't like to do all of those things, which is completely wrong. They love roller coasters. I guarantee you, if you went to Shanghai Disneyland right now, the line at Tron will be 2 hours long, right? And that's a great coaster, but there's going to be a 2-hour line to get on Tron. Happy Valley, there's a bunch of Happy Valley parks. They have mega coasters. They have B&M coasters. The lines for those are long. They love to participate. They don't want to lose face. But I think they feel, in a theme park environment, they feel protected. They feel like, I'm part of a group, I can get up on stage and make a fool of myself, and no one's going to care, because I'm with this group. And so I think there's some cultural sensitivities or cultural biases that we think as Westerners that I don't think are true. And I think the more we can understand that and the more we can suss that out, I think it makes us better designers, and we can deliver on really what they really like to do.
Ryan, what has your experience been as far as what has your technique been, so to speak, or your process for landing business in China, and how have you accounted for cultural differences?
Well, as Mizikra Entertainment, we've been very lucky to have great clients who have, in many cases, sought us out for something that we're known for, parades or live shows or media production or something specific. So we have that sort of advantage of being sought out for things. So I think that once we get into that conversation, we know pretty early on if it's a client that's going to be supportive and visionary and take chances. And we're really grateful for the clients that we have who've who've been supportive and has certainly made working in China easier and very successful and a lot of fun. There are definitely some real challenges. Travel and the cost of travel is a challenge. Contracts, and I mean, it's fair to say that there's no real recourse that we have as vendors in the USA with clients in China, apart from working together, mutually understanding the way. But that's not how contracts work in the United States. So that is a real challenge. Getting money out of China is a real challenge, not necessarily because of a vendor, but because it's a regulated currency, and there is a real process for making payments to vendors outside of China, and most of those things can be solved with patience. That's a word that we've all sort of said for various different reasons. There is a real need for patience. Earlier I talked about Americans are kind of known for being honest and direct. In China, there's a saying that we probably all heard of different versions of or whatever, but it's basically that the straightest distance the shortest distance between 2 points is a curved line, and that's completely different than our sort of Western thinking. And once you kind of wrap your head around that, basically it means we're going to get there, but it's going to require patience. And that is, from a business perspective, that's not what we want to hear. We want, sort of cause and effect. We did this, you pay us, it's time for this. There's certain, just clear-cut rules for doing things. So patience is respected in China, and it is required for American, or I would say European companies doing business there. Having said that, a good client makes everything a lot easier.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room a little bit, which is getting paid. What are some ways that from the negotiation process going into the contract that you can protect yourself so that you are getting paid in a timely fashion? Don't all jump at once.
To the extent that the client is Disney or Universal, they pay. That's not a problem. To the extent that it's a Chinese client, it's about the relationship. It's about laying the groundwork properly in advance and taking it one step at a time and making sure that neither party has too much of the other guy's work or money without reconciling that before you go any further.
I'll go on a limb here. As Music or Entertainment, we've been very successful getting paid, and again, a lot of that is having supportive clients, and that's we're proud of that. But I've been involved with projects in all sorts of ways, and there have been problems, and it goes, patience runs out, and one of the things that to me is most clearly part of the strategy, and I think Ms. Wong mentioned it also in her video, is when you have a clearly defined scope of work and you perform that scope of work, it's much easier to stay on track with payments. When you have three-way agreements or partnerships, or you're working on a project that requires coordination between multiple vendors, it makes it much more difficult. And one of the things that we have done, we work in a variety of ways, from consultants to media production providers, various pieces of projects. But when we are a turnkey provider and we're responsible as a producer to deliver the more entirety of a project, we tend to be more successful with timely and complete payments.
I think it's important to say that when there's a difficulty getting paid, in our experience, it's not an honesty or an integrity problem. It's not somebody trying to cheat somebody. It's a communication problem. When a project goes wrong for any reason, you trace it back, it's always something to do with communication, a misunderstanding between the parties. It's the same thing with getting paid. You need to communicate, and communicating in China is more difficult because of the cultural issues, if not the language. But the language is the least of the problem. It's the understanding of what the expectations are.
Yeah, and I think the way, as a contractor, you write a very clear scope of work. You delineate responsibilities as clearly as you possibly can. You avoid things like contingencies, miscellaneous, anything gray like that. You keep it very specific and you're descriptive, and you set up matrices of responsibilities so that you have a checkpoint as you go. And that helps. But you know what? We do that with American clients too. It isn't any different. We're a little more careful, and I think we're a little more exacting if we're working with Chinese clients to try to be as clear as we can about the services we're willing to provide and what exclusions we're not willing to provide. But generally, as Glenn, I find that the Chinese system very honorable. We have never, there's always, I've had problems getting paid from the guys down the road. So, yeah. But they always came through, and so have the Chinese. And I think there's I think it's a Western conceit. Oh, they're not going to pay you. We're not going to get paid. They're not going to pay you. Well, you shouldn't be doing business with people that you don't think are going to pay you. Shame on you. And I don't think it's a cultural attribute. I think my experience working with the Chinese business community, it's difficult, it's excruciating, there's a lot of details, a lot of dot the I's, cross the T's. Oh, you're 1 penny off on your calculation, you have to resubmit the invoice. We've been through all of that, but at the end of the day, it's always worked out for us. So, and I'm sure there are horror stories out there, but we haven't had them. Have you? You've been okay.
We have not failed to get paid in China. We failed to get paid for a part of the work in Singapore years ago, and it goes back to communication, and the guy who promised he'd pay us quit.
Oh, well, hierarchy is a real tricky thing over there. Well, I think you're going to bring it up.
Well, I mean, we deal with that, actually, the hierarchy at JRA, because we have, and this might be different from the kind of hierarchy that you're talking about, is because we've found with our Chinese clients, they only want to talk to the CEO. They're not really, even when we've gone from the contracting stage and actually into the project, Keith still has to be there for every meeting because they only want to talk to the boss, which has been an interesting challenge, because then we have a CEO who's on the road in China 26 weeks a year. To kind of bring this full circle and kind of end this segment where we began, Craig, you had, when we spoke on the phone last weekend, you talked about throughout the process of designing and constructing Shanghai Disneyland that you had learned as much as you taught. So your team learned a lot from your partners, and you taught your partners a lot as well. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, obviously, as designers, the exercise was to learn by the pure nature of of what we were there to do. We needed to learn the audience, as Paul's kind of very correctly said. But when it came to actually executing the project, we probably spent more time learning. And on the one hand, there was a lot to teach because, as I said, the complexity of our work, the detail of our work, the integration of our work is something that is not a lot of contractors and vendors would point to these wonderful buildings and say, this is proof that we can do anything, in a theme park. And it's not that they're not wonderful buildings, it's just that they're very different projects and very different challenges than what a themed entertainment challenge is. So we did do a fair amount of teaching, but I think we ended up learning a lot more because at the end of the day, we weren't the ones building. This was a project that was built. To Paul's point, some of the, a lot of the rides were not built in China. Some of the higher, the more complex showpieces were not built in China, but the rest of the project was built in China. And so we had to go to school on just if we were not going to compromise on the quality that we were going to achieve, we had to simply go to school on how we were going to achieve it. There was never a shortage of labor. There were, just to talk about construction, on a typical day, we had well over 10,000 laborers on site who were living on site. And so the opportunity there, to teach our craft, but also to learn what they were capable of. Huge amount of effort in sample programs and in training for themed finishes. Just to as an example, we ended up learning so much about, if you walk around Shanghai Disneyland, one of the things that at least strikes me is how beautiful the rock work is, how beautiful the facades are, how beautiful the paving program is. And we actually found that, again, contrary to a lot of, the first impressions of that country and what can be done, that we could get craft, unbelievable craft, even if we're trained. The people who showed up to the site were unskilled when they showed up. The training and execution of craft, artistic craft, even though, as usual, you have to go through 4 or 5 people to get to the one who can do it, was quite magnificent. Precision, totally different story. So where it was architectural ornamentation, had to fit perfectly. That castle, so we could sculpt these amazing big mountains very quickly and very efficiently. When it came to the castle, where everything had to be dead on, it just took a tremendous amount of time. And that was learned because we had to adjust the way we do things because the 10,000 people who were going to build this park were not us. And so a nice, I think, balance. Certainly we are a lot smarter about this market. If we thought it was Hong Kong, no. If we thought it was Japan, certainly not. It's a very unique market with very unique challenges, but also some wonderful benefits that we didn't achieve in other places.
So you got the job. Oh bleep, what do I do now? It's time to go all in.
The biggest learning curves is just, understanding the intentions of the client. These are, in this entertainment business, unfortunately, as you all know, we get a lot of very interesting characters in the business and developers who have wild ideas. And those ideas are great to have wild ideas, but then there is reality. So these, we really want to move ahead. Is the project going to move ahead? Is it really going to be built? Is it really going to be done to the quality that they're talking about? Are they really going to spend the money that they say they're going to spend? So talk is big, but then actions tend to be different, or they tend to be less.
I'd like to talk a little bit about contracts. In the United States, it's a much different situation than it is here as regarding contracts. Here, contracts take a long time to get to the final stages. There is a lot of talking here before you get to an actual contract in your hand and starting work. Sometimes I complain about the fact that they waste so much of the time discussing the contract. The scope of work barely gets discussed, mostly the capabilities. And then finally, when you do get the contract, you don't have a lot of time left. So making the client really aware of what the project actually takes time-wise is really important. The other thing is negotiations. You have to be very patient with negotiations. And they do expect to get some kind of a deal. So when you come in with your first number, you want to be sure that you mark it up a little bit so you can discount it later. I know that's sometimes a strange way of working, but that's just the way it is. So be prepared for that.
You have to be cautious when working with client, and fair but cautious. Where you have your your agreements and you have your payments that are staged, and they make sense. So you're getting certain kind of mobilization or down payment or what have you that gives you enough money to get moving. That there's payments on certain stages of delivery. So your payments need to be tied to something that's very recognizable. That's very that you're getting paid for that deliverable, for that product, whatever that's there, and that there's a way that if they don't make the payment, then they don't get the final deliverable. So somehow there's a way you need to think of withholding something at the end to make sure you're getting your final payments. Plan or think about doing something a little bit extra to give them something a little bit of benefit or some extra drawing or an extra meeting or something that shows that you're giving a little bit, you're 105%, 110%.
I think there's a saying in China that when the contract is signed, the negotiation begins.
So Glenn, we talked about the different levels of being in China, and you talked about the third as being going all in. What does that mean, and what are the various issues that you now have to consider? You've gone all in.
Well, there's forming the business and operating the business. And so let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of doing business. The legal backdrop, the accounting, the taxes, the HR issues. The knowledge that you've acquired running a business in the United States is not transferable at all to China. You can leave it all at the border. And you'll need to attend the School of Hard Knocks and learn it all over again. So talk about founding the business or creating the corporate entity. In the United States, you can go to the courthouse, get a business license, mail to the IRS for a federal tax ID number, and you're in business a week later. You can even decide after that what you're going to do to make money. Not the case at all in China. In order to create your WFI, your wholly foreign-owned entity, you must produce a business plan, and it must be well thought out. It's going to be reviewed by the government. By the time you have the business founded, you're going to think that the government is your partner because they will have been so involved in that process. You must write a scope of business defining what you will do and what you will not do. And it needs to reconcile well with the amount of money that you say that you are going to invest in the business and the rate at which you're going to bring the money into the country. It takes at least 3 months, if everything goes smoothly, to create that business before you can hire your first employee or you can sign a contract. Then when you get into business, the accounting, getting money into China is difficult. Getting money out of China is more difficult. In the US, company needs a bank account. Maybe you want a checking account and a savings account, but that's all you need to run your business. In China, we have 5 bank accounts, and 4 of them are holding accounts so that the government can inspect the money that is coming or going before you can move it in or out of those accounts to use it. So the fact that you got paid doesn't mean you can spend that money because the government may still be inspecting it. You hear about people using 2 sets of books, and you think if they have 2 sets of books, they're up to no good. Somebody's being tricky with the accounting. Not necessarily so in China. You may have 2 sets of books because one of them is your accounting system that enables you to pay your taxes according to the Chinese law because they're going to tell you what accounting package software package you have to use. You get it from them. It runs on their computer in your office. And then you have the accounting system that you use to manage your business. And one won't do the other's job, so you'll have 2 sets of books. When You want to be paid, you send out an invoice, and eventually 30 days later, hopefully, somebody will pay you. In China, it's the other way around, which is pretty mysterious, takes some getting used to. You can't get an invoice until you have paid. And that is because the invoice triggers taxes. So they don't want us to produce that invoice because that invoice is produced on a piece of paper issued by the government that says you owe them money. It makes it difficult to do things like your accounts receivable aging because you haven't got the invoice yet. You don't know how old that receivable is. So there's workarounds, but it's something new to learn. Taxes is a big issue there. There's a lot of opportunity for peril. There's also some opportunity to legally avoid taxes if you go through the process of learning how to do that. The implications of the VAT are profound. 17% VAT. You can imagine that if you don't handle that properly and you're supposed to pay it and then get it back. If you don't handle it properly, you pay it and you don't get it back, and there goes any hope of any profit on that job. So you need to understand this very, very well. You have to close your books monthly, accounting books, and that's a challenge. When you go to, at the end of the month, when you close the books, you go visit the tax authority, and you sit with a person who, the translation of the name of this person that you visit monthly to pay your taxes is the teacher. And the teacher will tell you what taxes you're going to pay. Some taxes in China are negotiable. So you need to have a good relationship with this teacher. And actually, it's not you because you can't talk to the teacher because you don't speak the language. So it's your employee. So you need to have a very good relationship with your employee who needs to have a very good relationship with the teacher in order to make sure that you don't pay any more taxes than you need to pay. And because of all of this variability in the tax picture, you can imagine how difficult it is to bid jobs if you don't understand all of that so that you can pay only the taxes that you really need to pay. Human resources, a quick example of how easy it is to get into trouble. We were doing a relatively innocent thing with our employees. We had originally one style of corporation, then we changed to another style, so we needed to move the employees from one to the other. No problem. We explained to the employees, your pay will be the same, your seniority will be the same. We're just moving you from one company to the other, no problem. That was okay with a couple dozen of our employees, but there was a little administrative mistake that was made very innocently. It seemed like nothing. We didn't realize, in fact, we even hired an outside expert in China to help us with this transition to make sure we didn't make any mistakes. But a mistake was made, not by us, but by them. As a result, if you can imagine this, that employee's child could not go to school. And he hasn't forgiven me yet. And it took a lot of effort to fix that problem. So there are a lot of costs that you don't expect with regard to HR issues. You know, you hire an employee in the United States, and there are additional expenses, Social Security, health insurance, workers' comp, and those add up to, we'll say, in the vicinity of 25% on top of what you're paying the employee. The comparable number in China is about 50%. You have to plan for that. There are expenses that you might not anticipate going in. Overtime is paid even to professional employees in China. 150%, 50% OT for over 8 hours a day, double time on weekends, triple time on holidays. And there are ways that you can bend those rules, but you need to know how to bend those rules. And you're only going to learn that by being there and having good staff who can advise you. There are expenses associated with employment. Employers in China are obligated to either provide the housing for the employee or pay into a housing fund for the employee to use to pay for their housing. Severance pay. If you let an employee go in China because you don't need them anymore or practically for any reason, you will owe them 1 month of pay for every year that you have employed them plus one. So if you've had an employee for 5 years and have to say goodbye, you're going to owe them 6 months of salary. And you have to plan ahead for that if that might happen. Hiring key staff. You need to not fall into the trap of hiring the employees who speak good English. if you're interviewing and one of them is able to speak to you very well, being able to talk to your staff is a great thing. So you want to hire that employee, but that may not be the one who can do the job the best. So you learn over time to let your trusted key staff do the interviewing and hire the employee who's best for the job, whether they speak the language very well or not. You know, in China, everybody speaks some English because they all learn it in school. And it's kind of like, you know, I took Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. Some of them are like that, but some of them speak English very well. So there's a wide spectrum there. And when you're interviewing, you can easily fall into the trap without even realizing it. I did in the beginning until I learned my lesson to not hire on the basis of language. Developing relationships with your key staff is super important because you're going to have to trust those people more, give them more keys to the company than you would here, because they're going to have to do a lot of business on your behalf because, if nothing else, you can't speak the language. For example, I've been in negotiations with clients and vendors where you walk out of the meeting and my Chinese employee, who was doing most of the talking because it was in Mandarin, when we get clear of the building, will turn to me in frustration and say, he spent the whole time trying to hire me. You know, which is understandable. They're thinking, if I can just hire this key employee away from this guy, I don't need this guy. Well, I understand that. You need loyal employees to work for you to help with this problem. So with regard to all these HR, accounting, tax issues, you might think, can I just hire somebody to do this stuff for me? Well, yes and no, because surely you can, but you're going to pay for that, and they're not going to completely understand your business, and they're not going to look out for you the way that you would. So in my opinion, you need to be there, and I believe you need to have some of the most key people in your company there to learn what's happening, and to bring the message back here to the US. If you send a key employee to China and say, start the business over there and check back with me every once in a while to let me know how it's going, when you hear about how it's going, you're not going to understand it if you're not there. You need to be there in China a lot of the time to understand all of this and make your own decisions. I think that if you're going to set up a business in China for the long run, you probably need to give yourself about 5 years to attend the school of hard knocks, stub your toe, before you'll learn how to make money and be successful in China. But once you've done that, there will be substantial payoffs. It's been very good for us. Many years ago, I was reading some management book, and I remember coming across the phrase, culture is all that matters. And being the analytical engineer type, I think I snickered and turned the page and wondered what that was all about. But now I can tell you, culture is all that matters. And if, for example, you think that the language is the problem in China, you've missed the point. It's the difference in the culture that you need to understand much more than the language.
Louis and Ryan, do you have reactions? Thoughts
Yes.
on
I feel like Glenn is the teacher that he mentioned. As an alternative to what he just said, we've worked for many years in China and have only been paid in the United States with taxes that were due in China being held in China without ever coming across to us. So there are alternatives. And one of the things that we found is that although there are sort of key regions based on Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Guangdong province, Macau, we have found increasingly that Hong Kong is an important soft landing spot that we can go to and can handle some financial transactions easier with mainland China than we can directly from the United States. And Hong Kong is a beautiful world city that has a special relationship with China, special autonomous region. And we have found, especially working in Macau, Guangzhou, Zhuhai, that Hong Kong is a good sort of entry point. And it's for people who have not done a lot of work in mainland China, it's a good spot to start from.
Listening to Glenn, it's sort of the list of gotchas. It's it's up, they got me, up, they got me, up, I got to pay attention to that. And I think that's all true, you do. But you're entering into something, and you decide if you're going to enter into it that you focus and you do it step by step. We receive payments both in China for some of our clients who want to work with our wholly owned foreign entity, and we receive payments to our American studios when the client prefers to work through our American studios. And normally, if they're working with our American studios, the tax implication is normally a burden. We put that burden on the client to make sure the money coming in is inclusive of any, that they take care of the Chinese tax implication of those dollars, because it's extremely complicated. And we pay the burden for the privilege of working in their country. And it is a privilege. When we go over there, we're guests in their country. We'd like to think we're invited guests. And if there's a tax implication, we have our accountants and our bookkeepers and our lawyers, and we go through the teacher and the gamut, and it's what you do. As far as being guest, I was talking with a Chinese person once over drinks, and he says, I love America, I've been studying America, and I've seen all these historic sites, and it's incredible, and I went on the Mayflower, and you're like Christopher Columbus. And I said, yeah, except I'd like to think we were invited to come to your country. We are not privateers. We are guests to their country. And what you said about culture is really, you know, all that business, everything that's being spoken about, I think you hit the key is you have to understand the culture, that curve, the point to point. You know, Western culture, we're Renaissance, right? We learned there's a fixed point perspective. You know, triangulation. Chinese art is your many different points of view. It's not the same culture. So, anyhow, that was great. That was every gotcha I could almost.
Craig, you're in a unique position because you have a park that's open. And when we talked earlier, you said that there have been lessons learned within Disney and also lessons learned from the visitors. What are those lessons?
Lessons being learned. We think that we applied ourselves pretty thoroughly to the process of really trying to figure out what this audience wanted and what might resonate with this audience. There are some things that clearly we can tell, even with the park only open a few months, that we probably overthought. Some of the examples Paul gave, I mean, the human beings are human beings, and we too agonize over would people like getting each other wet. And it's kind of laughable to look at some of the opportunities now that folks have, and they're humans. They adore it, of course. And they adore getting each other wet, and they adore competing, and they adore making fun of each other and themselves, and all those wonderful things that sometimes when you're sitting in a back home in the office you just overthink. And so I think this audience is unique, but in so many ways it's like any other audience we're gonna ever be given the privilege of entertaining. A couple of I think a couple maybe learnings that things that we didn't really expect. The draw of social media is intense. We expected. It's as if it's soft opening with no information from us. The guests knew exactly what to do. They knew what they had. They knew what they came to do. They knew the priorities. They knew the tentpoles that they were not going to leave till they experienced. They knew exactly where to go in the park before we handed them a map. And the device was probably much more important than we had to sort of gain control of the information on the device, because it was not under our control. And so a lot of people, silly long lines for some attractions that we had to sort of get on top of. But in a way, that's a good thing. It means that people are deeply invested in this. There's huge amount of curiosity and interest and excitement about it, and they want to consume. It's a lot of analogies, I think, early on, at the risk of generalizing, with our audiences in Japan, which is a very good thing for us, for all of us. Kind of some of the wonderfully wacky behavior of just wanting this as such a unique thing to their day-to-day, as compared to their day-to-day lives, that both of our companies have benefited a tremendous amount in Japan. A lot of similarities there. So we continue. There haven't really been the top 5 things we've learned. We continue to learn, and hopefully we'll do a lot more in that region. And hopefully we'll just, we'll continue. I think Universal will logically learn on top of Disney. Disney will learn on top of what Universal does, and just continue to grow in this market. But I can say the audience, I'm certain that the audience, there is an immense amount of pent-up interest in what we've done, in what Paul's organization is doing, and in what we collectively can bring to this marketplace. I had the privilege of being in Japan in 1983 when we opened that park, and sort of began to define Disney really fully to the Japanese audience. And there's a lot of parallel between that and this, at least in my own perspective. And that bodes, I think, well for a lot of us, because there's unlimited interest in what we're doing.
Paul, last question before we go to audience Q&A. How has Disney going first helped you?
Oh, it's tremendous. I mean, we have a working model of a world-class theme park that we can go look at and study, and fortunately, or maybe not fortunately, I had 23 years at Disney, so I worked with Craig many years ago. So it's great that we can go down and watch, even though we believe the Shanghai audience is maybe a little bit different than the Beijing audience will ultimately be. It's a Chinese audience that we can look at. We can see, how many turkey legs are they buying? By the way, a lot. Churros, not so much. But there's this working model that we can go look at, and we can see not only how is the park operating, how did they get it built? What vendors did they use? What design philosophy did they use? We can look at all of that as much as it's publicly known. We can look at that. And a lot of people have asked me, is there a rivalry? Disney and Universal and well, not really. I mean, there's an ego between designers about who's going to create the best thing or who's going to do the next great thing. But there's this. I think there's this camaraderie at our level that, hey, we're going to look and see what you guys did, and you guys are going to do something great, and so my bosses are going to ask us to do something great, and they're going to throw more money at us. By the way, that part never happens, but they're going to want us to do something great too, and so it's a great thing that Disney was there as the first to market world-class theme park. We've learned so much already. I think we're going to blow them away, by the way, just saying. But
I knew I shouldn't have said that to you two next week.
But it's really good. It's a great time for our industry right now in China. I mean, with Wanda trying to do what they want to do, and with Disney wants to do and expand, and obviously what we're going to do, it's a great time to be in this industry and be in the Chinese market.
I've got to add, Clara, there was a time in 2005 when I had 2 or 3 different clients come to me and say, Chinese people don't like pirates. They said because the word means sea thief, there's no romance there, and because sunken ships are a bad omen. And I rode Pirates of the Caribbean earlier last year, and guess what? Chinese people love a good story, well told, and they love a good show. And if you can deliver that, then you're successful.
Fantastic. Okay, now it's your turn. What did we miss? What burning questions do you have? Got a few around. Justin's coming around with a microphone, so make sure we can hear you all loud and clear.
Thank you guys very much. It's been a very informative talk. My question is for bringing team members over into the Chinese market while you're working on these projects. Are there any restrictions or visa challenges that you're finding as you bring more and more people over?
The only things that we've had to deal with is if you've had a criminal background. Do you have a criminal background?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Just only a problem at Universal.
Yeah. Because Disney hires criminals and. No, we have. There's no. We haven't. Obviously, we're a little bit further behind than where Disney was. So we're just now ramping up. Our HR department is ramping up to do the relocation packages and stuff. But I think the only China is pretty strict about if you have a criminal background, especially drug offenses or those kinds of things. They don't want to give visas to those kinds of people. But those kinds of people. That's we haven't come across that yet. That's just what we're hearing from our HR folks.
I mean, we sent a lot of people over, and we traveled. I mean, hundreds of people over on top of the expat group. One of the things, by the way, as another sidelight to this, we emptied the bench of our maintenance organization to come help when we really needed to manage the quality. So well over 200 people from the maintenance organization here alone came there. And we found it to be, to your point about your question about visas, we found it to be, I guess I'd say, to some degree administratively burdensome to do. There was quite a bit of work to do. We have the benefit of having a pretty close tie and people who are working full-time on both sides with government ourselves to manage this. So quite a bit of work, but never cases where we simply couldn't get somebody in.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just one other thing. If you are considering a relocation, really think about it. A relocation sounds romantic and it's cool, and I get to live in a foreign country. It's hard. I mean, it's hard to do. I mean, my wife and I, my daughter, we relocated to Paris for 4 years for Disney. And Paris is an easy place to be. People speak English. It's pretty much westernized, but it's challenge, right? It's not like a vacation. So some place like Asia, where it's a little bit even more difficult, you really should think about, do you have the right personality to take on that challenge? But it's totally rewarding to get that world experience, especially to get it on your resume, like you worked in Asia or you worked in Europe or Dubai or wherever it is. It's really rewarding. Just really think hard about whether you have the fortitude to put up with the challenges.
Having said that, I would suggest, because I got to know probably every one of our expats, over 300, and that group, I would say 9 out of 10 people would say that they very much enjoyed the experience of living in Shanghai, and the project, while unbelievably tough, was one of the best things they'll ever do. So I think that has to do with selecting well, selecting people who understand some of the things that'll just be very different, a lot of patience, a lot of teaching, but go for the adventure and go for something that is just so unique you'll never work in that sort of place again.
One over here.
What were some of the major challenges that you had with the LDI, the Local Design Institute?
Paul?
Well, there's not the challenges. There's not. I wouldn't say challenges. You have to embrace them. You're not going to avoid them. You got to embrace them. We have brought the LDIs in a little bit earlier because we want to, we just know that we can't avoid them. So we have embedded them kind of in our process. We haven't seen any problems yet. It's really the issue for us is educating them to what we want to do. We want to have live flame inside of a building. Well, you can't do that. Yeah, but we want to. So it's like there's this education part that's happening right now that you bring them out to our parks and you show them what we want to do, and then they start to get it. And they start to embrace the entertainment part of it. And we're not building a bank building or a hotel or a shopping mall. It's a different kind of animal. So for us, it's not so much of a challenge in working with them. It's the challenge of inspiring them to what we were trying to deliver. We have the benefit of not being first to market here. So a lot of the LDIs that worked on Shanghai Disney are now, coming to us with, hey, we have theme park experience, which is great. And I think understanding the LDI limitations, what they do best. I mean, there's, hundreds of LDIs, and they seem to be all specialist in something. So finding the right LDI is really key. Some are really good at civil, some are really good at architecture, engineering. You just have to find the right one.
As a design build, someone who builds attractions, we, traditionally, you start the work, you go through your schematic design, that gets approved, and then you start doing design development, which means you're really honing in on putting it inside the facility. We have learned when we're working with China, that is the point where we start engaging our Chinese support, because if we do those drawings with Chinese trained artists, designers, we find and we hand it off to those LDIs, local design institutes, who are responsible for making sure every code is complied with. They're like the quality control check for architecture. We find if you're a vendor, if you're an American, you're working over there, there is a stage where you're really wise to start utilizing local expertise before it gets to the LDIs, before it even gets to your client. And we think that's a really important service that you need to do as a company. So that's on our level. Disney, Universal, they're up here. Show set, attraction people, we're kind of down there. But we deal with it too, and again, learning the lessons of the culture and the trade, and what the expectation is. If I did a design, hey, we submitted a schematic design, world-class lighting designer, and the LDI took a look at it and said, who the hell designed these lights? This is horrible. What? You can't see with these lights. Had we done that, and that was a gotcha, had we done it properly, I think, had we vetted it through a Chinese design group, we probably would have had better success.
For us, it's not the LDI, it's the CSEI, China Special Equipment. For machinery, because we do control systems. It was a big help having our staff of Chinese engineers working with those folks. It was more of a natural environment, and in the end, it wasn't that difficult. There were hoops to jump through, but they were pretty much reasonable, and it all got done.
This is to sort of piggyback on the LDI question regarding the GC. What were some challenges, as well as what worked well with the GC when it comes specific to theme work? And then integration was used a lot in terms of the work. And so to BIM or not to BIM in China, building information modeling. Thank you.
Well, a ton of learnings. Maybe I'll just address it. I'll address the narrow part of those learnings as they relate to how much one might model and try to take modeling into that marketplace. We went very hard into the Shanghai project with 3D modeling. We figured that it was that it would help visualize. We imported a version of kind of our virtual design environment to Shanghai. We built relatively elaborate 4D models, and then so we went in pretty heavy, and then said, okay, now it's about the learning that we'll achieve. about what the appetite of these folks is to use these tools, because you can't force them to use the tools. We ended up probably the answer to that question is mixed, but in quite a few places, I'll take 4D modeling as an example, where we could help contractors who, if they didn't understand the integration complexity, which often they didn't, it was overwhelming, then they also likewise didn't necessarily understand some of, not building sequencing of a traditional building style, but of sequencing our work. And so being able to visualize it with a 4D model, it was less about them, the contractors advancing the sophistication and the detail of the tool. It was more about contractors being able to use the tool to visualize and visualize sequence. That was quite helpful. We were surprised in a bit of the third land, but at least 2 lands, a lot of appetite to understand, again, 4D modeling, to understand pull planning and to really go through the process of backward planning. For those of us who are pushing lean design and construction, there was quite a significant amount of appetite. Now, the government hailed it as the most technically advanced project ever done, blah, blah, blah. But that was a position, that was posturing. In fact, the contractors, I think, understood we were trying to do some things that were unique. We were trying to help them visualize what was complex and unique to them. And I would say, half to 2/3 reasonably successful. Not completely, but reasonably. And, so when it came, for instance, advancing those tools into punch listing, we did the entire punch list in BIM 360. The contractors picked it up, and 52,000 punch list items later, the contractors are out there using their iPads like we are. And they're, again, if we talk a lot about patience, we should talk equally about the fact that this marketplace and the practitioners in it, while your first impression might be, wow, that's a couple steps behind what we're used to in the West, the adoption rate can be at light speed. And so when an idea is good, I found time and time again contractors and vendors would pick it up and make it their own very, very quickly. So I guess a piece of advice, I wouldn't presume that there won't be adoption. I would lay out as many ideas and tools and then kind of test the adoption rate and see what will be picked up. And often, in a lot of cases, you may be surprised.
Time for one more quick question. Last question.
Hey, I think it was kind of touched on earlier, kind of talking about intellectual property and how that's handled over there. Because I know here, in the States, despite the rivalry, Universal, Disney, there's that camaraderie you're talking about and the kind of mutual respect. What challenges and how do you kind of foresee yourself staying ahead of maybe entering a market where that might not exist quite so well?
I'm sure there'll be other answers. I'll take a Disney shot at that. We decided, again, going with one of the themes of this, we decided that we were, we wanted to be in this market. It was a privilege. I love the point about the fact that we decided it's a privilege to be in this market and to be invited to be in this market. And we understood going in that there are some things that if we were too hung up about and if we tried to protect our IP, that we would probably waste a lot of energy. So going in, and this was not, by the time we got to the design and execution of the project, I think we were already past this point. Through the negotiation, it became clear that we were going to share pretty freely our IP and including a lot of the tricks of the trade, of how we do what we do throughout the country. And it became clear that it would be an uphill struggle to try to protect from that. So we just, in a lot of ways, we kind of went the other way. We opened up, I applaud Bob Iger, we opened up a research and development lab in Shanghai. We moved some of our R&D folks from Glendale there. We set up really 2 areas of research, sustainable design, and then really advanced, BIM techniques. And we basically set it up to very deliberately bleed IP into the marketplace. of things that we would use to develop this resort and others, but also things that we want to bleed out in the marketplace. We developed a pretty cool, at its scale, central energy plant that is a big, gigantic cogen at almost a city scale plant, and that was something that had never been done before there. And we helped develop a particular technology with a utility provider there that then got picked up and made a big example of what could be done at a scale of a city of 1 million people. So we just decided we're all in, and trying to be too protective of this was going to be a dead end anyway.
Best piece of advice in one sentence. Starting with Louis.
Well, I liked what you just said. I think it is a privilege to be there. In one sentence,
It can be a run.
if you enter that market, be prepared to share your expertise, but don't underestimate the quality and the depth of the culture that you're working in. The talent is there, and it's a learning experience for both groups in working in that kind of multicultural situation. I think that's it.
Good.
I would say before you go to China, study the history of China, the last 100 years in particular, because it'll give you a context with which to understand all of the things that happen that you don't understand. And I would say that while you're there, remember to be respectful. We are the visitors in their country. They were doing just fine before we got there. They'll continue to do just fine. They don't really need us. We need to be appreciative. They're wonderful people and they're great hosts and hostesses, and we can get frustrated. I've seen Westerners go there and get frustrated and talk about their frustrations in front of our Chinese hosts and hostesses, and that's just not a good thing. So we need to remember that when we're there.
My best piece of advice, I have two. One would be to plan and expect to do your best work, because it's a great opportunity to have an audience recognize your hard work. And two is plan on the expense of travel. It's expensive. No one likes paying for it. Clients don't like paying for it. Vendors don't like paying for it. Big corporations don't like paying for it. But to move people back and forth to Asia is expensive, and you just need to plan on it.
They are one of the most warmest, welcoming people I've ever worked with. They want us there. They want our product. They want westernized entertainment coming to them. With that said, they're very proud of their culture. They are very, they love to show it off. So just go, if you go to China, be respectful, have a point of view, but just listen to what they're saying as well.
Perfectly stated. Everything they said, just be clear about your priorities and your values. Be clear why you're there in the first place. Be patient and steadfast, and understand that you have often very different approaches to something. But in fact, as long as you're dead clear about what your values are and what your priorities are, and patient enough, you'll do extraordinary things and just enjoy that adventure, because it is an adventure.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us for Is Working in China Right for Me? While this wraps up tonight's dialogue, this does not wrap up the dialogue on China, and we'd like to hear from you on where the dialogue from China should go next. Should it be a webinar? Should it be on the TEA blog? So my email is crice@jackrouse.com, and I'd love to hear from you on how we continue the dialogue on China. I'd also like to hear from you, we'd also like to hear from you on what the next TEA talk should be. What are some of the topics, what are burning questions you have in the industry that you would like answered by some of our industry experts? Remember, if you are looking for advice on doing business in China, we have a pretty big presence. TEA has a pretty great presence in China. We also have a TEA Asia Pacific board with members that are happy to answer whatever questions you have. Just go to teaconnect.org, click on divisions, look for Asia Pacific, and you'll find a list of all of the board members. And just send them an email, and they'll be happy to answer any questions you have and share their experiences. To continue tonight's discussion, we'd love to invite you to go next door to Pilar's. But before we go, which is the bar next door. But before we go, here are some final thoughts on doing business in China.
My advice to doing business in China, as I said, is number one, you have to plan ahead. You have to look for long term. You cannot look for short term return. And you need to have a lot of patience. And you have to do your homework and try to understand what the Chinese market is. And you also got to have a good partner. So with all that said, I wish you all going to have a good luck and be able to launch your business with China successfully. Thank you.
Last piece of advice is it's a big opportunity, and I hope to many of you decide to come over, and TEA does have activities and events around the region on a semi-regular basis, every couple of months, and we have events going on in places like Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong. And those are our resources, and there are TEA board members in different cities that you can feel free to reach out to as well, to say hello when you're traveling around or want to meet people while you're traveling and exploring the opportunities.
So I say, be cautious and come on and, join the fun.
Have a great night, and we'll see you next door.